So surveys, they're one of those things that seem really easy in theory, right? Like we all know how to do surveys. You ask a lot of questions, you get as many people as you can to answer those questions, and then you make a bunch of pie charts and bar graphs, and you try to find insight and meaning. But the thing about surveys is, while they are really easy in theory, in practice, they're really easy to screw up. You could ask questions in the wrong order, you could use the wrong words, and you can end up with data that's either completely misleading or completely useless. And if you're lucky, you recognize the data as such and you just throw it away, or maybe your survey is not that important. But if you're using that data to make real business decisions, bad data could mean like you spend a year's worth of dev resources on a product that nobody wants, or you spend all your marketing budget on something that doesn't impact revenue. So what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the common mistakes that I see people make when they're doing surveys and how to solve for them. And I have two goals. One is that you'll be able to write better survey questions so you can get better data and drive your business forward. Or two, that you'll maybe be a little bit more critical of some of the studies and surveys you see published online. So let's get into it. The first thing you can do, by default, ask questions on a 5 or a 7-point scale. Now this is what you see when you see people say like, I'm happy to be at MozCon, strongly disagree to strongly agree, or how important are conferences to you, not at all important to very important with 5 or 7 points in between. And the reason that scales are good is that they give us a really good picture of what the situation is. The problem is that a lot of us default to yes/no questions. Are you happy with your job? Yes or no. But that sort of question gives us really simple data to work with. It doesn't tell us how strongly people feel, and it doesn't give us a good picture of what to do next. So we could ask that same question in a slightly different way. I'm happy with my job. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. And now we get data that looks like this. We get an average score. We get a distribution. We can see, do people just sort of like their jobs, or do people really like their jobs? It gives us a good picture. And the cool thing is that now that we've asked this on a scale, we can use this data and compare it to other questions and do correlation analysis or regression analysis later on. So the reason we like 5 or 7-point scales is that researchers tell us that 5 or 7 points do a really good job of capturing variation without overwhelming the respondent with choice. They're also good because they're odd numbers, which means they have a midpoint. So you can have like a neutral or neither agree or disagree, so you don't have to force people to lean in one direction or another. The next thing you can do are break down big concepts into tangible pieces. And customer satisfaction is a really good example of this. A lot of times we just ask, are you satisfied? But satisfaction is actually this really fuzzy topic. It means different things to different people, and usually it's not just something that exists on its own, but it's the sum of a lot of different factors. So instead of just asking one question, are you satisfied, you could break it down into 3 questions. You could ask, are you happy with your purchase? Would you purchase from us again? And does our product meet our needs? And you can take the scores to those 3 questions and sum them up and have one overall score for satisfaction. And now you not only know if people are satisfied, you know how satisfied they are, you know why they're satisfied, and you know where you need to improve. And so you've taken this vague concept of satisfaction and you've turned it into an action plan. Now another way to do this is by product feature. You can get a 5-point scale and ask people how satisfied they are with each feature. And again, you're going to get an overall score for satisfaction, and you're going to get a breakdown by feature so you know where you need to invest your content or your resources to improve. Now the next thing is probably the biggest opportunity that I see people miss all the time. And that's comparing answers across questions. Basically, it's segmentation. And the reason we all miss this is that when we get our survey data, we treat each question as a separate entity. We make a graph for each one, and we never look and see, hey, if people answered one question this way, how'd they answer the rest of the questions? And I'm going to show you why that matters. So this is an example of a satisfaction question that maybe an agency or a SaaS company might ask. They want to know, how's our product quality? How's our price? How's our account management? And just like before, you get data that looks like this, an average score for each piece of the business. Now in this case, things look pretty good. I'd be happy if this were my business. But the problem is that this is hiding very important data. This is misleading data. If we were to break this down by client type, we'd see a very different story. Here we can see that our small businesses are very dissatisfied about price, while our enterprise clients are very dissatisfied with their account managers. Now, if our enterprise clients are where we're getting all of our revenue, this has huge implications for training and staffing, and we would have completely missed this if we'd only looked at satisfaction as a question by itself. So to get at this sort of data, what you can do is, if you're familiar with Excel, use pivot tables. Otherwise, tools like SurveyMonkey have a compare tab or a crosstabs feature that'll let you get at this data and compare segments. Something to keep in mind, though, is that surveys are anonymous, so you're not necessarily going to know if your client is a small business or an enterprise. So it's something that you're going to have to remember to ask. So it's good to plan some time up front strategizing about the types of segments you're going to want to use so you can remember to ask those questions as you go. All right, now I'm going to talk about how much power you as a survey writer have and how much power you have to actually screw things up. The first one is with priming. Now, in 1996, a group of researchers got together, and they had some students fill out some sentence scramble worksheets, right? A bunch of words, have to organize them into sentences. And the student was supposed to walk down the hall and turn it into a researcher. Now, unbeknownst to the student, the researcher was actually deep in conversation, and the researcher was waiting to see whether or not the student would interrupt them. Now, not all these sentence scramble worksheets were the same. Some had words like rude, obnoxious, interrupt, and others had much nicer words like polite and calm and patient. And as you might guess, the students who had the rude worksheets were way more likely to interrupt the researcher, while the students who had the nice words waited patiently for their turn. And so we call that priming. And you might be thinking, what does this have to do with surveys? And what I want you to do is think about your introduction and your description of your survey as its prime. So last week on Twitter, I saw, this is a good example and a bad example, I saw a community manager survey. And the tweet was, please take our community manager survey so we can show people how valuable community managers are. Now, I agree that community managers are valuable, but by setting that mood and that tone that the purpose of the survey is to prove that community managers are valuable, that could influence the way that people answer the questions. Maybe a better way would have been to say, please take this survey so we can help people understand what community management is. So your instructions set the tone for your survey. Order bias is pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand. Using the example of an industry survey again, if I were to ask somebody, how important is link building, and they told me link building is very, very important. If I followed up with, well, how much link building do you plan to do this year? They're going to exaggerate. They're going to tell me that they're going to do a lot of link building because they just got done telling me it was very important. So the way to get around this is by randomizing your question order, and pretty much every survey tool in the world, again, allows you to do this. You just have to look for the feature. So by randomizing your order questions, you can get around survey bias. Now, this next one is where we get a little bit uncomfortable, and I apologize in advance. I thought about not including it, but I decided it was important. In 1999, a group of researchers got together, and they had students play golf. Now, one group of students, they told, this is a measure of sports intelligence. The other group of students, they told, this is a measure of natural athletic ability. The students that they told was about sports intelligence, the white students performed significantly better. The students that they told it was a measure of natural athletic ability, the black students performed better. Now, they never explicitly mentioned race. They just sort of implied something that could hint at a stereotype, and as a result, behavior changed. And it wasn't just this study that shows it. A lot of studies have shown it, and it's true of gender as well. In another study, women were asked to take a math test, and there were either 2 women present in the room or 2 men present. And when the women were present, the females performed significantly better on the math test. When the men were present, they performed significantly worse. Now, I'm sure none of us want racially charged surveys, and none of us want to include gender bias, but I think it's something that's important to keep in mind, that even just the implication of something that could possibly hint at a stereotype can affect people's answers. But even stepping away from some of those emotionally charged topics, let's go back to an industry survey. Think about asking for someone's job title up front, or asking them how much they make, and getting them to think about their place in the company. How might that affect their answers for your industry survey? So again, something that just even begins to hint at a stereotype or people's place in the world, it can influence behavior. And that's actually usually why you see demographic information go at the end, because it's still important information to ask. It's just not something we want to influence the rest of people's answers. So double-barreled questions, much easier to get, much less controversial. Basically, you don't want to ask and/or questions as yes/no questions. Do you play games in your smartphone or tablet? Well, what if I play both? What if I play just one? It's unclear. Each question should ask one thing and one thing only. Leading questions are also very straightforward, but they're important to be aware of. The classic example that scholars and researchers use is this: if you ask people, do you support helping the poor, they're very likely to say, yes, of course I do. If you ask them a somewhat related, though not exactly the same question, do you support welfare, Americans tend to say, not so much. And the thing is, these questions get at a similar idea, but they're not exactly the same. But the simple choice of wording elicits very different results. And so some of the ways that you can account for this are by pre-testing your surveys, by A/B testing your questions, or at the very least by being cognizant of how the words you use might impact people's answers. So those are all the ways that you as a survey writer can screw up your data. Now I want to talk about how all of your survey respondents can screw up your data, whether they mean to or not. And the first one is with sensitive information. Nobody likes to talk about their age or their income. It feels very personal, and people don't want to share it. This is usually why in surveys you'll see ranges like, do you make between $30,000 and $50,000 a year? Are you 26 to 35? It's a lot easier to commit to a range than to tell somebody explicitly what you make. It's also why you see demographic information go at the end of surveys, because people are a lot more likely to be honest after you've built some trust throughout the survey. Boredom is another one that I'm sure we've all run into. It's also known as survey fatigue. And basically what this is when you get to that point in the survey where you're just so freaking tired of taking it that you just start filling out random bubbles without paying attention to the questions. So a couple ways around this one. You can set expectations up front about how long the survey is going to take and actually be honest about how long the survey is going to take. You can show a progress bar as people go through the survey so they feel like they're getting somewhere. And most importantly, you can limit the number of questions you ask, so you're only asking the most important questions and keeping people engaged throughout the whole survey. The last one is how people don't really mean to screw up, but they screw up all the time. And that's because guessing is hard. I've seen questions like, how many minutes a day do you spend on Facebook? How many minutes a day do you spend on Facebook? I don't think any of us have any idea how many minutes a day we spend on Facebook. A lot more reasonable question would be, do you log into Facebook multiple times a day, once a day, weekly, multiple times a week? That's a lot more fair, and we're going to get a lot more accurate information if we're reasonable about what people will be able to tell us. And so once you start asking better questions, you'll be able to do a lot more interesting things with your data. You'll be able to do a lot more than pie charts and bar graphs. So I'm going to use the example of Moz and Open Site Explorer. Let's say they want to measure how people use OSE. Traditionally, they might have just asked, how often do you use OSE? But maybe now we can step it up. We can use a 5-point scale, and we can break it down by feature. Ask, how often do you use each of these features? And then compare that to, how would you rate each of these features? And then compare that to how important are each of the features to you. And now we end up with charts that look like this, where we can use it for product prioritization. We can see, what are the things that people use all the time but don't actually like? Or what are the things that they rarely use but are actually hugely important to their subscription? It gives us a much better idea of where we need to spend our dev resources, where we need to create content. And overall, it's just a much better picture than a stupid pie chart or bar graph. So lastly, I just want to quickly run through a few types of questions that you can ask and what kind of data you'll get from them. The first one is categorical questions. These are the ones I've been hating on the whole time. These are the yes/no questions. Are you male, female? What's your favorite movie genre? They're the kind of questions where you get words instead of numbers as your answer. And I hate them because all you get are these stupid bar charts and pie graphs. You can't do a lot with them. You can't find averages. You can't do correlations. You can use them for segmentation, but that's about it. Now, ordinal questions are a slight step up. These are ones where you use ranges. They're like categories, but there's a clear order to them, thus the name ordinal. But again, you're limited to things like bar graphs and pie charts. You can't take the averages of questions like these. Let me reiterate that one. You can't take the averages of questions like these. You can't use them for correlation. You can use them for segmentation, but that's about it. Interval and ratio questions are where we can start to have fun. And this is that 5 or 7-point scale I was talking about earlier. Ratio questions are similar, but you just ask for a number, and it's kind of fill in the blank, and there's a true 0, which is why they're called ratio questions. And this is where you can do interesting things like measure the mean, median, and mode. You can look at distributions. You can look at correlation analysis and see how your data is related to each other. You can do cluster analysis, which is my favorite kind of data analysis, and allows you to do things like, Instead of sitting in your marketing meeting and saying, I think we have 3 personas and let's try to figure them out, you can use your interval and ratio data and let the data tell you, you actually have 5 types of customers, and these are their demographics, and this is how they behave, and now you have data-driven personas. Regression analysis is another really cool thing you can do, and that will show you how different variables can predict things like purchase behavior. So you can invest your marketing budget in the things that are actually going to drive revenue. Now, I just showed you a lot of cool data analysis. Unfortunately, in 15 minutes, I can't get into how to actually do all of that. But I can point you to the Excel add-in called the Analysis Toolpak. It'll let you do some of these things like regression. And I can promise you that if you start to ask better questions and you start to use the right words and the right form, you'll be able to get data that lets you start doing cool things like this and making better decisions for your business. That's it.
Thank you so much. I am pretty sure that all the Mozzers in the front row here and folks throughout are like, oh my God, write down all the things. I saw there was lots of note-taking and probably chat in our chat room and whatnot of things that there's lots of discussion currently going on about various types of surveys and things. And so I know that it, for us, is a very, very top-of-mind topic. I'm curious to know, I'd like to hear, like, what is one thing that seems to be like the biggest gaffe that people constantly make when doing surveys and things like that?
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem that people have is, like, we all try to get really good sample sizes, but we make this mistake when we try to extrapolate that out and generalize it to bigger populations, right? Like, our data has limitations, and that's fine. We're not market researchers with tens of thousands of dollars. But we just have to be aware that the data we're getting isn't from a perfectly random sampled population, and so we have to be careful about how we generalize that across everyone. Just be aware of limitations.
Definitely, that makes sense. It looks like we have time to take one question out here.
Awesome, Stephanie. I just had a quick question. As far as sample size to find statistical significance within your surveys, what do you kind of suggest as far as we do a lot of surveys for creating content around statistics, and I'd be curious about your input about sample sizes for surveying the amount of people.
Yeah, so if you have the money, 1,000 is the gold standard, and that's great. If you're on a budget, 300's a little better, and worst case, try for 100. I mean, it just depends on your budget, but in general, more is better.
Excellent. Then it looks like do we have any more questions out there? No? Okay. Again, Stephanie will be hanging out, and we'll have lots of time after. You have lunch after, and so we'll be around for more questions. And again, I'm pretty sure you're about to get bombarded by folks in pink T-shirts who are going to ask you lots of questions. Thank you so much, Stephanie.